Hello again, Yaksamash, and welcome back to Wrench Reads, Trilogy of Morgalla, Diary of a Lonely Demon, number 9. If this is the first Wrench Reads you've watched, click the on-screen annotation appearing right now and go back to the introduction. And as always, the novel that this reading is off of is linked in the info bar, or the link to the Amazon, anyway. Well, once again, we're back, and I'm glad to be doing this. It's going to be the third week in a row of regular videos. I got to get back into some kind of habit. But what I'd like to talk about in the introduction this week, before we get back into this first section with Jasper, is a little bit about research. Research specifically when you're talking about, well, papers or writing in general, but novels specifically. Creative writing is one of the more interesting things that you can do as a writer. It allows you to use a lot of it allows you to use personal creativity and just your own personal interest to create and craft stories and characters and settings and just wonderful things that people have never seen before. I mean, you can look at anything that has pretty much become its own cultural sensation here in modern life, or even in historical life. Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings, or Moby Dick, or The Golden Chalice, things like that, that came from these fantastic writers who all essentially developed this setting to be essentially its own little world. It could be realistic, it could be unrealistic. It could be fantastic, it could be very scientific, very hard. It could be relatively, dry, or it could be incredibly vibrant and vivid. Or it could be any number of things in between. But one thing that all of these types of writing have in common is it has a sense of consistency. It has a sense of development in both setting and characters and all the actions that the characters take. Now, when it comes to novelizing things, or writing a novel, it's not as simple as you might think. Heck, even short stories can take a lot of time, depending on how much you want to donate to it. But research is one of those things that take up most of the time, especially if you're doing a longer piece where you have to build a complex setting. I'll use something that it's been mulling around in my head for a long time. I've always wanted to put it into writing, and I may eventually, but it's essentially a fantastic setting that takes aspects of modern technology as well as a lot of your more fantastic things, like very large flying beasts, anti-gravity, things like that, things that are both scientific and fantastic at the same time. But each one of those things to actually have each have its own bit of development and each have its own bit of consistent storytelling within a story requires a bit of background research. For instance, when you're talking in character, I'm talking dialogue, if you have characters who are talking in a modern sense, like I'm talking right now, very conversationally, very informally, it's going to sound different than somebody talking 50 years ago and in lingo, say, dedicated to aviation or nautics or maritime conversation, or even just standard conversations in a 50 years ago kind of setting. Each of these things have to be developed to make it seem and sound realistic. But why am I bringing this up now, when it's, of course, I'm talking about Trilogy of Morgalla, Diary of a Lonely Demon? Well, I've mentioned it a lot in the previous kind of bits of writing that I've read of John's, that things don't sound solid. Things don't sound as they would in a different kind of setting. It sounds very modern, very essentially dry, modern, and like you would hear if you went out onto the street right here in wherever you live, and got into a conversation with somebody about something. It doesn't sound like you're sitting in hell or standing on hell talking to a demon about, the weather. It doesn't sound like you're actually talking to a demon in demonic hellspeak because everyone speaks English. This shows to me, and I hope it would have shown just to you guys, the viewers, that John has no interest in researching what actually occurs and what the creatures and the organisms the aliens, the demons actually sound like, or even how they think. Because I'll use a quick example before I get started on the actual reading. A good example would be a book from a point of view that is not human. For instance, a book from the point of view of a dragon. They will have different thought processes directed at different things. They will see things differently. You don't see any of that when it comes to demons, or even any of the aliens. It's all on purely modern day, white, Christian, American terms, human terms. So, that was a bit of a ramble, but I hope I made my point about the difference between how you would frame a setting based on not only different perspectives, but on different time frames, settings, as well as mindsets. And how the book that we're currently reading right now really doesn't have that. But we'll get more into that when we go back to Hell to look at some of Morgalla, to read up what's going on with Morgalla and her character when we get there. Of course, this is a continuation of Chapter 3, the chapter called Jasper Davis. Thank you for, and if I don't say it before I quit for the day, thank you for coming by. I hope you enjoy what I'm about to read, and I'll probably put a timestamp in the beginning, just so if you want to skip the ramble, feel free. It's kind of too late. Okay, so this wasn't even a section break where I stopped last time. It was literally just a paragraph break between Jasper sitting in class to now Jasper sitting in Mr. Kent's office. Oh, and speaking of Mr. Kent, my rewrite is taking a bit longer than I thought. I'll probably try to post it up on the Morgalla Sucks Facebook page within the next day or so. Gotta get it edited before I can really post it, and I don't want to just post some pile of garbage. But yeah. So anyway, paragraph break. I'll read the sentence before it, and then we'll go on. His heart sank, for it probably would be another failing grade. This was Jasper sitting in class, whinging about his grade, or the grade on the desk. After class, Jasper sat slouched in a chair in Mr. Kent's office. It was just a bit bigger than a closet, with a desk and a bookshelf. The walls were white, and mostly covered with banners sporting the circular peace sign. There was also a poster from President Flesh's campaign, a fake smile on a two-dimensional figure. Jasper sat alone in a broken chair, awaiting his teacher's appearance. He was aggravated. Upon seeing the very low grade on the essay he had worked so hard on, he nearly crumpled it the instant it hit his desk. What annoyed him the most was the fact that he went out of his way to make his writings as politically neutral as possible. He saw now what he would have to do to get any high grade in the class. Finally, Mr. Kent made an appearance and shuffled into the room. He sat behind his desk, looking over Jasper's grades. "You didn't like this draft either?" Jasper sounded almost desperate. "There's some good news on this black day." "It could have been better," Mr. Kent replied. Jasper was more frustrated with himself than anything. He honestly thought he had gotten it right this time. "I've lost count of how many drafts I've made, and it's still not right," Mr. Kent repeated. "Ironic that you use that word." "Look, Jazz, I'm not satisfied with your essays or any of your writings. Because I disagree with you? Jasper observed. Their faces were locked in a silent battle. Neither was going to back down, but it was clear that Mr. Kent had the upper hand. Have you given any thought to another major? Mr. Kent asked. Everything in my essay was factual, Jasper said, bringing the subject back to the matter at hand. Look, you might not have been aware of this, but we're calling them the founding framers these days, not fathers. Are you saying that I should just give up? Are you saying that I should give up? Jasper asked. I need this class for my degree. SCC doesn't offer a journalism degree. I'm going for an English degree, Jasper continued. I need that to transfer, and I need this class. Yes, Mr. Kent interrupted. Jasper, can I call you Jazz? Italics, not an actual quote. No. Jasper remained silent. As with Mariette, he found that arguing would be a pointless venture. Jazz, listen, Mr. Kent continued. I've tried to have you see things in a certain way. Is it my fault that you haven't? If I fail this class, it will ruin everything, Jasper exaggerated. Not to mention it will bring my GPA down. Not unless you drop it, Mr. Kent suggested. As I suggested, Jazz, you can always change your major. Another italics, no quote. Bastard! Jasper left Mr. Kent's office. The talk they had didn't help at all. In fact, it only filled his head with confusion as to what he was going to do. One man stood in the way of his education aspirations, and he just didn't know what to do next. As he left the office, he saw Missy Ryder standing there, leaning against the wall. She gave him a smirk. You are unbelievable, she said. Jasper said nothing. He zipped up his jacket and put his bag over his shoulder. 2 periods, extra long pause. Missy smirked, looking at him as he walked away. Pathetic, she muttered. Missy looked at Mr. Kent, who motioned for her to enter his office. She entered, and he then closed the door. Jasper stepped out of the building and looked at the campus. He glanced at the sign on the building, which read, Community College. For years it had been like that, with the administration never making the effort to replace the missing letters. The crumbling red bricks of the building made the concrete below turn red. The sky was painted with many shades of gray, not a patch of blue to be seen. The sun was setting, though you wouldn't know it. Many thoughts ran through his head, all of which were melancholy. He sighed as a cold wind blew over him and through the uncared-for grass filled with weeds. With his bag over his shoulder, Jasper made for the parking lot, looking forward to ending his day. That's the end of the section. Short section this week, but the next section is going to be incredibly long, and it's actually the end of chapter 3. This is a relatively short chapter. So let's roll back. There's a couple things, again, that I'll go over, and then I'll go into essentially why I'm going to be talking at length or rewriting the Mr. Kent section. The first thing, I kind of pointed it out at the beginning before I actually started. Jasper doesn't have a section break here. There's not a double-spaced paragraph or anything. It's just one paragraph to another. And that really makes for a kind of a jaunted flow because you're jumping scenes here. He's going from pining about his bad grades at his desk in class, where this would have actually been a perfect time for John to kind of outline why he doesn't like Mr. Kent, why Mr. Kent is, as we're going to see here in a minute, the evil liberal professor who is just giving Jasper a bad grade. We really don't see much more of Mr. Kent until later on in the book. The kind of professor that John kind of... The only real thing that really makes Mr. Kent resemble kind of the liberal professor is a couple of very few, very subtle kind of ideas. For instance, the peace sign. The walls were white and mostly covered with banners sporting the circular peace sign. I don't see a problem with that. I mean, I don't see a problem with, and let me clarify, I don't see a problem with this character liking peace. However, it's a very kind of a black and white construction of Mr. Kent. I mean, the second thing is there's a poster of President Flesh. Flesh is the name of the president of the United States whenever this book takes place. A fake smile on a two-dimensional figure. It's interesting that in itself is an interesting discussion of what John thinks, or Jasper thinks, of the president. And while he doesn't actually say it, that in itself implies the president is kind of false, duplicative, deceptive. There was also a poster with President Flesh's campaign, a fake smile on a two-dimensional figure, as compared to, of course, a three-dimensional figure on a statue or something. And the next kind of thing that I'm more aggravated about than anything is how he kind of sets up what you're supposed to believe about this community college. There are like 2 or 3 different things here in this section that really delve into what Jasper thinks of his own school. Jasper sat alone in his broken chair. The office itself that Mr. Kent has is incredibly small. And then at the very end, if you couldn't tell, I'll post up what it actually says in the annotations. But he glanced at the sign on the building, which read Spade Community College. It's supposed to be, of course, Springdale Community College. And while this is one way of doing it, just to make it not as jarring a transition in this scene, he glanced up at the sign of the building, which read Springdale Community College. However, several letters were missing, and it makes it not as kind of jarring, specifically because we don't know what the name of the town is yet. You don't know if that's Spungdale or Sprungdale or something. We really don't know. So, again, this is me being too critical. I know I'm being too critical here. But also, missing bricks, crumbling buildings, unkempt grass. But then again, you have 2 other things. As far as the unkempt grass, cold wind, cloudy days. This could be wintertime, or late autumn, where they stopped kind of taking care of the grass. But we don't know that. We can assume that it's... Because of the cold wind, we have to assume that it's a later or colder season. But... Okay, so... but this doesn't make any sense, specifically with the community college not taking care of either its buildings and its infrastructure, or the weeds, or the desks and the chairs. Now, I will admit that there is some things that not everything's perfect when it comes to a college campus. Some things kind of slip through the cracks. A broken chair here, a table missing a peg leg somewhere there. But just the sheer decrepitude. I don't think that's a word, but the fact that it's so decrepit implies more about John and Jasper's view of this campus than anything else. Because a campus like this is more or less it's more of a for-profit educational institute than a lot of your state universities. A lot of these places spend a lot of the money, or bring in a lot of the money through tuition, and that's how they pay their staff, keep the buildings up to date, etc., etc., etc. And the fact that these buildings are not being maintained says that either tuition is really low, in which case they can't keep it up. It's essentially a negative it's a negative cycle where you don't have enough to support the buildings, you have to make cuts and the buildings fall apart, or you pay your teachers, who therefore try to keep the students happy and give a quality education. But it doesn't strike me like John has actually thought that through. A crumbling campus will not draw students. Most students will tour a campus before they start classes, before they even choose. I toured my undergrad campus as well as about a half a dozen others when I first got into undergrad, and a couple of them I did reject outright, not because of things like crumbling buildings, but because they didn't have the proper program or a decent program in something that I wanted to actually partake in. But again, the programs are more important than the appearance of the buildings. And we'll actually get into next section how Jasper thinks that Mr. Kent is underworked and overpaid, despite the fact that there's so many things that are missing here. There's so many things that are missing, but John sets it up to where the reader really comes off believing the exact opposite of what he wants you to believe. For instance, as I said in the previous section, Mr. Kent is wearing ragged clothes, roughed up jeans. He works in a closet. He has broken chairs. The campus is falling apart. This doesn't indicate to me that these teachers are being overpaid. It implies to me that there's financial woes at this campus. But of course, that's not what John wants us to bring out of this section. He doesn't want us to see this place as, a struggling community college that's trying to get by on limited funds, that's having to pay its teachers less than the average. No, he just wants us to see it as, the campus is trying to get John down. Everyone's trying to get Jasper down. I'm sorry. Everyone's trying to get Jasper down. The teachers are failing Jasper. All of these different things are broken and not being cared for. This place is a shithole, yet Jasper has to suffer through it. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't actually come across that, especially to me, the reader, which is essentially what this should be written for, rather than the author. And yes, this book is in fact written for the author rather than the readers. Because if he cared about this stuff for the readers, he would have actually taken it into account. That's my long rant. I do apologize. Now, the next part of this section goes into why Jasper's failing. And this kind of gets back this goes back to Morgalla here. So let me read these things. And this is Jasper's talking about Mr. Kent and Jasper are going back and forth about why Jasper's grades are so low. You didn't like this draft either? Jasper sounded almost desperate. It could have been better, Mr. Kent replied. And I've lost count of how many drafts I've made, and it's still not right. Of course, Mr. Kent. John essentially implying that Jasper is a right-winger by this. And it's still not right. Ironic that you use that word. It shows that Jasper and Mr. Kent obviously have disagreements. And Jasper puts it in here that he went out of his way to make his writing as politically neutral as possible. That obviously isn't what's happening here. Now I keep getting back to this, that Mr. Kent is obviously not. I mean, Mr. Kent is human. Everyone's going to bring a little bit of bias into a position. However, much like I mentioned last week, if you don't teach with some sort of objectability, or with some sort of objective standard, you will be either worked around or canned. And because Jasper is calling Mr. Kent instead of Dr. Kent, this implies to me that even if this guy has tenure, he hasn't been able to hold on to it, or he is not actually tenured. Like he's a master's student who got a job at a community college, which is the most common thing if you're not a doctor. So this is the primary kind of problem with Jasper and the essentially antagonist of this section, which is Mr. Kent. Mr. Kent is failing him because Jasper is not doing something "quote unquote" right with his writing. But we really don't understand. We really don't get what that is, and it's still not right. The only specific thing that Mr. Kent writes is something that's a piffle. It's completely pointless to the overall content of an essay. It is a small aside. What you call a group of people in an essay is not grounds for failing someone. So there's something that's not being said here. Let me read that again. I'll read the entire section. Everything in my essay was factual, Jasper said, bringing the subject back to the matter at hand. Look, you might not have been aware of this, but we're calling them the founding framers these days, not fathers. That is absolutely petty. That is the most petty thing ever. And so again, either Mr. Kent is this petty, academically dishonest douchebag, or there is something more wrong to Jasper's writing than John actually includes here. And then Jasper said, bringing the subject back to the matter at hand, the following sentence, Jasper actually changes the subject back to, are you saying that I should give up? I need this class for my degree. And Jasper's, of course, going for an English degree. So that's me being too critical, I know that. Mr. Kent suggests that Jasper changes his major, but this implies more than that. This implies more than just Jasper, or that Mr. Kent is failing him. You're not suggested to change your major unless you are really failing hard. And I'm serious, because I've seen folks fail numerous classes, still have the funding, and change their major because they're failing. You rarely will see someone change their major unless there's a serious problem, be it the teachers at the school, be it a major grade point issue where even trying to make up the classes would be a waste of time, or some mix of the two. But again, you don't have the whole picture here. Mr. Kent is... Jasper is maligning this Mr. Kent character without actually giving you the story as to why you should hate him. So, but that's really the only thing that's left. You have a really brief interjection of this Missy character. And the point here, I don't understand the point of what John's trying to do here. He's essentially trying to make Missy look like a dick. Whoop-de-doo. She calls him pathetic. She calls him, let's see, you are unbelievable. Pathetic. Completely ignoring why or how that came about. Is she saying he's pathetic because, what, she overheard the conversation through Mr. Kent's door? Because if I wouldn't call that pathetic, I would say, okay, you have options. Why is he being unbelievable? I wouldn't call that unbelievable. What just went on in Mr. Kent's office. And then Missy, the girl who supposedly got all the good grades in the previous section, is now being called into Mr. Kent's office. Why? Why would you call essentially the quote-unquote straight-A student into the office? Especially if because the door apparently wasn't closed in Mr. Kent's office, but I think what Jasper's trying to imply here, when Missy comes in, closes the door, that Mr. Kent is having an affair. Mr. Kent is getting some of Missy Ryder, which is kind of ridiculous. Specifically because we have, in the next section, Missy Ryder and her boyfriend working out. And that's the next section. I'll get to that. So whatever Missy Ryder's doing in that office is probably to do with academics, not with not with anything carnal. Specifically, because later on in the book, Missy Ryder actually states kind of openly that she loves Steve. She would never, essentially implies that she would never go behind Steve's back and cheat. So, okay, I've rambled on long enough. I do apologize if this one had a little bit less structure than others, but anyway. All right, folks, have a good one. I can't wait for next week because, again, it's filled with more awesome of Jasper being Jasper. So, until then, na zlo rano, na zdrowie,